There's this idea that wood is carbon neutral in terms of what happens in the forest because you cut down trees and they grow back. But in fact, depending on the starting condition, like what was the forest that you logged in the first place? If it's old growth, you're going to create a big carbon debt that you might never recover.
We need forests. They're the lungs of the earth. They're also home to more plants and animals than any other terrestrial biome. They protect watersheds and mitigate flooding, provide us humans with recreation, inspiration, and well-being, and of course, they contain vast amount of carbon and the ability to draw down much of the carbon currently in the atmosphere. And it's because of this carbon sequestering quality that wood products, particularly those in the building industry, have come to be deemed as carbon neutral or carbon negative. And while wood may be the lower carbon option compared to concrete or steel, there's much more to the story. As Jason Grant, manager for corporate engagement on the forest team at the World Wildlife Fund, explains, not all wood is created equal. In fact, not all wood is good. To truly understand the carbon impact of a wood product, one first has to understand the forestry practices used to harvest it, and how carbon flows through various types of forests, something Jason often illustrates through his leaky bucket analogy.
Yeah, the leaky bucket analogy. Basically, the idea is that forests are huge stores of carbon, especially mature forests. So there's a lot of carbon stored in the vegetation, primarily in trees, but also all the other vegetation. Trees, wood is about 50% carbon. And then there's also a lot of carbon stored in the soils. Depending on the forest type, it can be the majority, like in the boreal. It's like 60 or 70% of the carbon in the forest is stored in the soil, and it's less in the tropics. It's about 50% in temperate forests. And so whenever you go in and create any kind of disturbance, whether it's a human disturbance or a fire or whatever it is, and you remove that vegetation or you expose the soil to sunlight, you get a release of that stored carbon. And so if you go in and intensively log a primary forest or a mature secondary forest, so primary forests are forests that are basically undisturbed by human activity. Old growth is, the colloquial term that people usually use. And then secondary forests are forests that have been logged in the past, but you can have forests that were logged a long time ago and have grown back. And so their carbon stores have built back up. And so both of those forest types store a lot of carbon. So if you go in and log it, especially if you log it heavily, you get a short-term release of carbon from the soil, and then all the leaves and branches, there's a lot of stuff that gets left in the forest, the roots, all of that rots in the relatively short term and releases its stored carbon. And then you also get a carbon release from the soil. If there's exposure to sunlight, the microorganisms in the soil go into overdrive. And so you get a release of that soil carbon. And so the idea of the leaky bucket analogy is that if you envision the carbon that's stored in a forest as being the water in a bucket, in an old forest, the bucket is just about as full as it can get. So the forest, the trees and other plants, they're constantly sequestering carbon. They're removing carbon from the atmosphere, and then, they're dying and rotting or they're blown over in storms. So there's always a drawdown of carbon from the atmosphere and a release of carbon into the atmosphere. But in a climax ecosystem, that's relatively stable. It balances out, and the carbon stored in the forest is as much as it can be in that system. The bucket is full. If you go in and log it, you are punching holes in the bucket. You're releasing some of that stored carbon. And if you go in and log intensively, so you do big clear cuts or you do frequent entries, then you have more and larger holes, right? And so that water level, that carbon storage, how far down it falls is tied to the intensity of the harvest practices. And so any logging of a primary forest is going to cause a release of carbon that eventually will build back up if you leave it alone, right? The bucket will refill. But if it's an old forest, you might have to leave it alone for 100, 200, 300 years. And generally, we don't do that. There's this idea that wood is carbon neutral in terms of what happens in the forest because you cut down trees and they grow back. But in fact, depending on the starting condition, like what was the forest that you logged in the first place? If it's old growth, you're going to create a big carbon debt that you might never recover. If you go and plant trees in an area that doesn't have any and they grow and you harvest it, you actually have a carbon surplus that you've created. You've drawn down some of the excess carbon in the atmosphere. So the approach to forest management, the type of harvesting that you're doing, whether it's more selective logging or small clear cuts that are spaced further apart or big giant clear cuts that are close together, that is going to affect the forest carbon stores, the water level in the bucket, and then also the starting condition is a key factor. And in fact, forest carbon is never neutral. It's always in flux. And the overarching point is that if you are looking at using wood because of carbon benefits, because, say, it has a lower carbon footprint than non-renewable materials like concrete and steel, then you really should be caring about the forest that it came from and understanding the starting condition and understanding the forest management practices, because those impacts in the forest on forest carbon stores and rates of sequestration, they can far outweigh other emissions associated with manufacturing and transportation, for instance. They can dwarf it, right? It can completely skew the picture. And so if you leave that out, which is typically what happens, say, in life cycle assessment studies, there's an assumption of carbon neutrality. But in fact, that assumption is false. It's just that so far no one's come up with a methodology to measure those changes in forest carbon stocks systematically across the entire landscape of working forests, and then to translate those changes into the products that come off of that landscape. There isn't an accepted way to do that. People are working on it, but so far, no good.
Wow, that is really interesting. It debunks just such a big myth around using wood. Are there any ways to start to gather that data and at least get some semblance of an idea of whether or not you're using climate smart wood or not?
There are methods for collecting the data. People know how to go out and measure whether there's carbon added over time to forest carbon stores or whether it's subtracted. It's just that someone has to pay to do it. And so if you are managing the forest in a way where you're adding carbon, you might want to go out and register it as a forest carbon project that can qualify for carbon credits that can be sold in voluntary or mandatory markets. And that's happening all the time. But it's only done by companies who are doing that kind of forestry that creates what's called additionality. And the amount of credits that you get are tied to the amount of additional carbon over what happens at the regulatory baseline, right? So there's a floor, and then you can operate above and beyond that regulatory minimum. And when you do that from a carbon standpoint and you register and go through the process and pay the money, then you can get carbon credits, which you can sell. So that's one way, is to source from registered forest carbon projects. But another good proxy is certification. Forest Stewardship Council certification, FSC, is the gold standard for certifying forestry and forest products. It's kind of like certification for organic agricultural produce, only the standards and the label are applied to forestry and forest products rather than agricultural products. And FSC requires a number of things that are above and beyond that regulatory floor that tie to climate benefits, both in terms of carbon storage. But then the thing that we haven't talked about is ecosystems and resilience. And that's extremely important too, because in the face of climate change, forests that are diverse, that have a diversity of species, a diversity of structures, meaning different ages of trees, intact soils with healthy fungi. All of these things make a forest more resilient in the face of climate change and less prone to fire, catastrophic fire. Whereas monoculture plantations, what's called business as usual forestry, particularly in certain geographies like the Pacific Northwest and the Southeast US, where you see a lot of large scale clear cutting, it's kind of analogous to how you grow corn in the Midwest. They're not really forests, they're plantations or tree farms. It's all one species, southern yellow pine, Douglas fir, and they're the same age. They're spaced equally. Of course, there's some other plants and some forms of wildlife, like deer or whatever. They may thrive in that kind of system, but it's nothing like a natural forest ecosystem, or it bears little resemblance. It's like the difference between a cornfield and a wild prairie, right? And so that natural forest is more resilient and resistant in the face of climate change and stressors like pests, disease, all of these sorts of things that can come in and wipe out large areas of forest. The natural forests are better suited to stand up to it. And so you can not only manage the forests to increase their forest carbon stores, that sort of management also tends to maintain the integrity of the ecosystem. Those two things typically go hand in hand. So that's an important component as well. If you want climate smart wood, if you want wood that is better from a standpoint of addressing the climate crisis, then you want wood from climate smart forestry. And our understanding of climate smart forestry is forestry that supports the maintenance or increase of forest carbon stores and the maintenance or restoration of complex forest ecosystems. That's really at the heart of it. And not all wood is necessarily good, or at least not all wood is necessarily the same. And so it's important for the discerning end user, specifier, owner, whoever it is who's considering using wood and thinking about it from a climate standpoint, to try to identify forests that are being managed above and beyond the regulatory minimum, which, everyone should follow the law. So it's not that meaningful to operate at that level. So Forest Stewardship Council certification, FSC certification, it has requirements in its standard that both lend themselves to increased forest carbon storage and are around the maintenance of ecosystems.
Where do those kind of tree farms fit into the equation? Are those considered climate smart? It doesn't sound like it.
We wouldn't call it really climate smart. And it's not that there isn't a role for that kind of forestry. Like we do have a need for timber-based products, right? We use a lot of wood and paper in our society. And so pumping out as much volume as is possible from as small a footprint as possible can be part of the solution. But should you go in and replace a natural forest with a monoculture plantation? No, right? We have a lot of plantations already. So, and we can improve the management of those plantations. So for instance, using less of certain kinds of chemicals. It might not be a climate thing, although it is related to climate. If you use a lot of fertilizer, that's tied to a lot of emissions. So, and certain herbicides are tied to emissions. And then the other thing, I don't know what it's like in the Southeast, but in the Pacific Northwest, the main commercial species that gets grown and harvested in the main timber producing regions, which are west of the Cascade Mountains, is Douglas fir. And Douglas fir grows pretty old, like it will grow up to 1,000 years, the oldest trees. And in a natural Douglas fir forest, you'll have, these canopy dominant big trees that will store the majority of the carbon in the entire forest. They hold a lot. So if you are going in and doing this model of an intensive industrial forestry where you're clear-cutting, replanting, it's a monoculture. If you let those plantations grow older than is the industry standard, you significantly increase the carbon stores if you're doing that across a landscape. The maximum yield of timber, like the maximum amount of volume that you can get from that kind of harvesting regime, and the maximum carbon storage that's tied to it, is like 80 years, 85 years, letting the trees grow to that age. But they typically cut them at half that age, roughly, because of return on investment, the time value of money, discount rates. So it's entirely driven by profit maximization. It's not driven by maximizing production or increasing carbon storage. And so that's an example of how the way our economic system works and the pressures that companies are under to maximize profit within the law, undercuts these objectives of leveraging forests as a climate solution, working forests as a climate. And there are some companies, big companies, who are managing to a higher standard and are doing things like extending rotations. So that it's possible to have our cake and eat it too, but we should be seeking to improve forestry at scale as much and as fast as we can, because the house is on fire, right?
When it comes to specifying climate smart wood, and you mentioned FSC, but are there other criteria or things that people should be looking for? I know not all certifications are created equal.
Well, first of all, FSC itself, its standards could improve when it comes to addressing these issues. So for instance, there's nothing in the standards about extending rotations beyond the minimum. You have to do sustained yield. You can't take more out of the forest than grows back, but there's nothing about extending rotations. There's a number of competing forest certification systems. In North America, the main alternative to FSC is called the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, or SFI. SFI was created a few years after FSC was launched by the American Forest and Paper Association. It is largely an industry-backed system. They do have some environmental groups, other stakeholders involved for sure, but major environmental groups like WWF are all involved in and supportive of FSC because it sets a higher bar. So I definitely would say that SFI is better than nothing, but again, if you go to those industrial plantations in the Southeast or the Pacific Northwest that are doing that model of intensive forest management, big clear cuts, monocultures, chemicals, all of that is certified under SFI. So we definitely recommend that people preference FSC where they can find it. Some products aren't available FSC certified. And there's a lot of people out there who are doing good climate smart forestry who aren't certified to any system. So that's another important point. And one thing that is difficult is how do you identify who those forestry operations are? So I'm involved in an initiative called the Climate Smart Wood Group, and we have developed procurement guidance. And one of the things that we've done in that guidance is said, well, okay, you can use recycled, reclaimed, salvage wood. That's great from a climate standpoint. You can use FSC certified wood. That's a good proxy. But then you have all these non-certified operations. And we are going to give you a definition of climate smart forestry. It has the kinds of things that we were just talking about, additionality of forest carbon storage, complexity of ecosystems. There's also a social component, treating people right. And here's our definition. If you, project team, owner, identify forest owners and managers who you think are doing good stuff and align with at least components of this definition, figure out how to source their wood. And here's some suggestions as to how to go about it. But, obviously that's based on some subjective judgment. There are various groups out there who will support project teams who probably don't have, they're not experts in forest management. So you can go to an organization that you trust, that knows a lot about forests and forestry in your region and say, well, who can you point me to? And then figure out how to support them through your specifications and procurement. But it puts it at the discretion ultimately of the project team. You don't have this proxy that you can point to and say, oh, they are being audited every year, that they're meeting this standard, and the chain of custody, the companies in the value chain are being audited every year to make sure that they're handling the material properly and the stuff that is represented as certified meets the requirements. You have control mechanisms there, and you can rely on those mechanisms. Where a product is certified, it comes into your project, has the label or has a claim on an invoice. It's backed by this entire system, and you don't have to do all of that additional research and legwork to understand the forestry sources and identify them, and then to try to pull their timber through a complex value chain. It's a lot more work to take this more kind of do-it-yourself approach, but we do offer a lot of guidance around that. And there are efforts to develop alternatives to FSC that are a little more robust, but are credible and are trying to identify people who are forestry operations who are a cut above.
I'm glad you brought up the Climate Smart Wood Group. I wanted to mention that there's a ton of great resources there, and even specification language that can be used. And on the Climate Smart Wood Group, there's some suggestions of protocols or steps to follow, and a big one is around the transparency and traceability of data, understanding that is such a layered, nuanced, and complex kind of topic. But are there some high level pointers that you could provide on how project teams can obtain some of that transparency and traceability data?
I mean, this ties back to this this pathway or this option of sourcing non-certified wood, because you don't necessarily need all that if you're buying certified. Again, you're relying on this system of auditing and standards, and so you don't necessarily need that visibility up the supply chain. But if you are trying to identify specific forestry operations that aren't certified and evaluate them and understand, what are you doing? Do we think you're climate smart? Then you need disclosure of information at that source level. And if you were thinking of using certain products, then you need to work from whoever's offering those products to you up a value chain to the supply areas from which the primary mill, a sawmill, a veneer mill, a mill that is buying logs and doing that first step in processing, they're the ones who know where the logs are coming from. They're the ones who know who the forestry operations are. And so ultimately you need to work up the chain and get to them, and then get them to disclose information about the landowners. And then you can evaluate the landowners. Again, unless you have like a trusted organization that you can go to that can give you a shortcut, and then you could work the other way, right? You could say, oh, okay, here's the landowners. Who are the primary mills in this, where the landowner is in their woodshed, in their supply area? And is there a way that we could work with that primary mill to do that first processing step and then pull it through the value chain to whatever it is that we're using, whether it's mass timber or flooring or whatever it might be, because there's going to be multiple steps. So it really requires mapping specific supply chains and understanding who the key players are, and getting them to work with you on disclosing key information and doing whatever it is that you want them to do, so that you can get the product you want, or at least support the right landowner. It's very costly generally and onerous for certain actors in the value chain to segregate material through the supply chain and get you a specific product at the right time. And so there's other approaches that you can take, and I don't know that I'll get into detail, but for instance, you could work with a primary mill and say, okay, we are going to use this amount of mass timber, and we know that this mass timber package requires this amount of lumber. And we want to support these 3 landowners in your supply area mill. So we want to see that in the last year, you bought enough logs to cover the amount of lumber that we're going to need for the package. And so even though we're not going to source that directly, we know that through our purchase, we are supporting these landowners because you are buying a sufficient amount of material to account for the amount of material that they're using. And then you don't have to do that segregation if you take that kind of approach, but you need to be working with the mill. You need to have the mill disclosing, some sort of evidence that they've done that, purchase orders from the landowners, purchase contracts, whatever it might be that can give you some confidence that they've actually done it.
That's really interesting. It kind of reminds me of regenerative farming and the farmers that are practicing that versus conventional methods. And I know a lot of websites have been popping up where they're trying to aggregate lists of regenerative farms and things like that. Is there any kind of online database or website that you know of like that for forestry?
There's databases of the certified forests. So FSC has a list of the FSC certified forests. SFI has their list of certified forests. There's an international umbrella for the forest certification systems that compete with FSC. So SFI is the system that's recognized in the US and Canada, but there are competing systems all over the world that are under this umbrella of the Program for the Endorsement of Forest Certification, or PEFC. So there's a PEFC Germany and Indonesia and Brazil and what have you. So they all have lists of their certified forests, but there is no one definitive list of everyone who's doing climate smart forestry. And one of the challenges is that in the absence of a certification standard, which, it's clear, it sets a bar. An auditor goes out and checks that a forestry operation is meeting that standard. And so that gives you a cutoff point. But if you're looking at non-certified operations, it comes back to the thing of it being at the discretion of the project team, because there's a spectrum. It's not black and white, right? It's not like you go from, climate dumb, climate dumb, climate dumb, climate dumb, whoop, climate smart. There isn't, without a standard, there isn't a basis for doing that. Someone is going to need to make a call, a judgment call. And so, I don't know, you look at organizations like Sustainable Northwest and the Pacific Northwest, or New England Forestry Foundation. There's others who are really focused on certain regions and identifying landowners of all types who are practicing what they consider excellent forestry or climate smart forestry. You could go to organizations like that and say, I'm looking for a list of people who you would recommend. You can also go and find lists of the registered forest carbon projects who are doing that forestry that provides additionality. Those are lists that exist, but there's different registries. It's not all in one place. And
thank you for sharing those resources and that insight. I was curious, is it ever possible to go walk a forest or see their practices firsthand?
Absolutely. FSC organizes tours of FSC certified forests from time to time. I'm sure that SFI does the same thing. And then sometimes just, landowners, they're proud of what they're doing. And, if you contact them and ask for a tour, they could grant it for you. So it's not like there's like one website that you can go and sign up for forest tours. But if you contact the certifiers, the certification schemes like FSC or SFI, and say that that's what you're interested in, especially if you can get a group together. I've been on tours of FSC certified forests in Northern California where I live, where there's a bus packed full of architects and designers and contractors from the San Francisco Bay Area. And you all go up and you spend a day, spend half a day in the forest and some time in the mill, and then, sit around a conference table and talk about what you've seen and eat snacks. And it's a really fun thing to do. And there's no substitute for it. You can talk about this stuff, but you never can really grok it without seeing it, right? Yeah, and seeing the difference. That's what brings it home. The people I know who are most motivated to do this work and, not just buy whatever's convenient or cheapest off the shelf are the people who have gone out and seen it.
Should be a call to action then for everyone to try to do that. I was curious, why are EPDs and LCAs not necessarily the best tools to determine the climate impact of wood?
It goes back to this assumption of neutrality for forest carbon. So basically the way that LCAs work according to the current overarching international standards, as long as at the national level, the forests are more or less in balance, you're not driving down the forested area, then you can make this assumption of carbon neutrality. But that doesn't account for the fact that, we have like parks, right? We have all these forested areas that are not working for us that could be growing back. And then at the same time, we could be harvesting forests in certain areas and driving down the carbon stocks, right? It's this big global average. And so it disguises more than it reveals. And again, if you look at it, what's actually happening in terms of carbon fluxes in a managed forest, it's never neutral. It's just that there is no accepted methodology for LCA studies to capture those changes in forest carbon stocks and then translate them into the products. So if I'm buying lumber and this sawmill is sourcing logs from this area, how do I understand the forest carbon stock changes in that area in a way that can translate it into specific batches of lumber? Because typically, like a sawmill, they'll buy from a whole bunch of different landowners in the supply area. And one of them could be doing really intensive forestry that is carbon negative. And then others could be doing forestry that's, much better. And so having again, a systematic, generally applicable method to measure the impacts of forest management on forest carbon and translate it into products, we're just not there yet. So you have to take an extra step. And there are people who are working on that who you could talk to. I'm not an expert, but unfortunately today, all LCAs for wood, they only measure the emissions associated with the manufacturing and transportation and the harvesting. So, whatever fuel is burned by the equipment that they use to log, that gets measured. But those changes and, what happens with the water level in the bucket, there's an assumption that everything's the same, which, of course, if you go out and clear cut old growth, it's nothing like the carbon footprint of the wood in that forest that's carefully managed or a plantation that was established where there weren't trees before, right? It's just the real picture is completely different.
Do you foresee any certifications like LEED making this more of a step in the certification process where you have to kind of take that next step in certifying that the wood is actually climate smart wood?
Well, LEED is long recognized FSC, and LEED V5 is, LEED's under a revision process now, and we'll see what they do in this version and how they treat forest certification. Living Future is trying to work on an alternative compliance pathway to FSC that, remains credible. And that's a work in progress. The timber industry is way behind other materials industries in terms of accounting for this stuff and providing the information, right? And so EPDs for concrete now, product-specific EPDs for concrete and steel, the providers of products made from those materials or of those materials, they're all providing product-specific EPDs that account for the full greenhouse gas footprint of their materials, and people can compare this product from that supplier versus that product from the other supplier, and they can plug those into their whole building LCA model and say, well, if we use this or versus that, or we design our building this way using these materials versus those, what are the impacts? And with wood, you only get that to a very limited degree because all that's being compared are those emissions associated with the operations, the harvesting and manufacturing and transportation. You can't make comparisons, real, valid, quantified, verified comparisons of what happens in the forest. So until those methods evolve, you're going to need something in addition to an EPD in order to make this, do this intentional sourcing of wood. And that's Climate Smart Wood Group in our guidance. That's what we're trying to offer is, okay, yeah, get the EPD, but seek additional information or seek certifications, credible certification.
Kind of on that note, I saw a post you made on LinkedIn about wood ID testing, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. It seems like there's some technology, perhaps, I don't know if it's in the US yet or if it's just in Europe.
Wood ID testing is not going to tell you anything about forestry. It can verify claims as to the origin or the species of a wood product. It doesn't work for fiber-based products like paper. But if it's lumber or flooring or plywood, you can take a sample and send it to a lab, and they can do one of a number of tests. Depending on the test, it will provide, you do certain tests to identify species, for instance, and then there's other testing methods to verify origin. And this becomes important from a compliance standpoint, there's regulations related to legal wood. And a lot of times when wood is illegal, there's false claims as to where the wood comes from or what the species is. And so this is a way to check those claims. It's important from a compliance standpoint. The limitation is that in order for this to work, you have to have reference data for the species and the geography in question, because if you do a test, you have to have something to compare the test result against. And so someone needs to have gone out and collected samples from the forest and tested them using that method in order to then be able to use these wood ID testing techniques for compliance purposes. So there is a nonprofit that is building a comprehensive open access library of reference data called World Forest ID, and WWF is working pretty closely with them on trying to get companies to both adopt the testing methods and to drive the gathering of reference data. So that's an effort. There is a lot of reference data that's been generated in the U.S. The U.S. hardwood industry in particular has been supporting efforts to gather reference data for U.S. hardwood species because they're looking to get an edge for U.S. wood by providing this data. And there's new techniques, there's new technologies that are evolving. There's a very promising one that the U.S. Forest Service, the Wood Identification Science Center, I think it is, WISC, they've come up with an innovative technology that could revolutionize this and greatly reduce the cost of both gathering the reference data and doing the sampling. But it's been piloted. It's not widely available yet. But this is in terms of cracking down on the illegal wood trade, it's super promising because right now, from a compliance standpoint, many companies rely on reviewing documents, and documents are easily faked. Or they rely on audits and certification, but an annual audit that's pre-scheduled, the company knows that they're coming, and the auditor only sees what they show them, isn't necessarily the best way to crack down on the laundering of illegal wood. Those of us who are working on trying to crack down on illegal logging, we're pinning a lot of hope on these wood ID techniques.
Wow. So many layers to this. You guys at WWF, you guys launched the Forest Forward project and produced that impact report. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Our Forest Forward program is our signature program for working with companies. So what happens is companies can join, and when they join, they commit to two main areas of work. One is responsible sourcing of products. And so we work with companies both on the paper side of the industry and on the wood product side of the industry to support them in the responsible legal sourcing of those products that they handle. And we have a time-tested, structured approach for doing that. And then the other thing they commit to is to make investments in large-scale integrated forest conservation and restoration projects that WWF is working on primarily in the tropics. So we focus on areas that are high biodiversity, high carbon stock, high risk, and it's tied to saving elephants in Vietnam and tigers in Sumatra, but not only that, because in order to save them, you have to save the ecosystems, which is that's the larger point, right? And then the restoration component is super important because you're not only trying to preserve what's left, but you're also trying to bring it back and create connectivity between patches of remaining old growth or primary forests so that wildlife can migrate, and you have more ecosystems and more habitat and better water quality, all the environmental services that forests provide. You're trying to rebuild that. And so our corporate partners, our Forest Forward participants, are required to support that work financially. Often they're looking for projects that are in their sourcing footprint.
It seems like there's more of these kind of smaller producers popping up regionally in different cities that are kind of practicing urban forestry, where they're taking wood that I guess just from urban environments that have been felled or have fallen from storms and things like that. Do you think that is a good route to go?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a really exciting burgeoning industry around urban wood in particular. And yeah, there's a huge amount of street trees that get taken down for different reasons, or like you said, trees that come down in storms and parks or whatever it might be. And for the longest time, this timber has had nowhere to go in terms of value-added wood products. It gets chipped and goes into landscaping or goes into landfills, and the volume of material available is staggering. I don't have the statistics. There's people who you could talk to who know this chapter and verse and are deeply involved in this effort. Taking as much of that volume as possible and turning it into long-lived wood products, you're not only capturing, storing more carbon, you are taking pressure potentially off of natural forests that now you need to log them less intensively because you have all this material that's coming out of urban areas. So I think it's very promising, very exciting. We're fully supportive of it.